Hey, 2033, it's Dr. Wilderman again. And today we are going to talk about interest elements. These are also referred to as elements of newsworthiness, but we don't want to just call them elements of newsworthiness in this class because they actually refer to other types of media writing, so not just news. So we're calling them interest elements, but you might also hear in other textbooks, other classes, your instructor might refer to these as either elements of newsworthiness or news values. But so that's what we're talking about today. Let me get the slideshow going. All right. So before we talk about, there's a list of interest elements. Before we talk about that list, I want to have a quick discussion about the difference in news and information. Because the dictionary definition, if you look these two words up, the dictionary definitions for news and information are nearly interchangeable. They're definitely synonyms of each other. But that's, a definition is different than working with news or working with information. So if you're in a media job, we have to think more critically about the differences in what's information versus what's news. So not all information is news. In fact, I'd like you to think of news as a subset of information. Now, all news will contain information, so they're related. But let me give you an example. So if you go to Gaylord College's website, you're a prospective student or you're thinking about transferring to Gaylord College, you get a list of all of our classes, a list of the different majors that we offer, a list of a master's program, a doctorate program, undergraduate programs. Okay, all of that is a big old pot of information, right? But if you were to just write that up, sentence after sentence of what Gaylord offers, that's not a news story. Even if you tried to sort of shape it into one, that on its own is not news. It's just information, which is really helpful. But let's say that Gaylord College has been working on a new major to add to its offerings. That might be news. Certainly, it could be news from a public relations standpoint, where if Gaylord College created a new major to add, probably our communications people would put out a news release about it. And it might rise to the level of news for like the OU Daily. They might do a story, or the Nightly, they might do a story on how Gaylord is offering this new major. So I hope that helps illustrate the difference a little bit. Not all information is news, but news and information are related. All right, so now that we have that down, in previous videos, in previous reading that you've done in the class, I'm sure your instructors in your labs have asked this question right here, right? What is news? And there's so many different ways that we can define it. There's so many different ways that different professionals have defined it throughout the years. But I want you to think of it in this Venn diagram that's right here. I want you to think of it in terms of three factors. Things I care about, and when I say I here, I'm referring to the person who's the media writer, the person who's the journalist, the person who's making a documentary, the person who is writing advertising copy. So things I care about as the media professional, things my audience is going to care about, right? And things that impact society. Where the three of those meet, that's usually where news creation happens, right? Now, not saying that as a journalist or another media practitioner, you always get to write about the things that you care about most. That's not the case. But often we do, especially when we get to pitch our own ideas. We're usually pitching something that we care about. So this is just yet another way to think about that philosophical question of what is news? Things I care about, things my audience is going to care about, and things that impact society. Where those all meet in the middle, news happens there. All right. Now let's finally get to those interest elements. All right, remember I said they might always also be referred to as elements of newsworthiness. They might also be referred to as news values. Okay. Now there's different lists across different media textbooks. Different professors will use different lists. I've seen lists that are as short as 6 elements and as long as 10 elements, but this is the one that I prefer to use, that I've been using for many years. This list of 8 elements of interest. All right. So they're impact, timeliness, novelty, human interest, conflict, proximity, prominence, and currency. All right, great. I've listed them off, but what do they really mean? So let's talk a little bit about each one. All right. If a situation, an issue, if it has impact, that means that it affects people, right? The more people something affects, the bigger the impact it is, right? So a tuition increase on the OU campus, it impacts those on the OU campus very much. At a local OU level, that has a lot of impact. At a huge state level or at a bigger state level, it still has some impact because a lot of people in the state are tied to OU. At the national level, doesn't have nearly as much impact. All right, so the more people something affects, the more impact it has. Timeliness. To me, timeliness is one of the most straightforward ones. Something's happening now, or it's happening really soon, or it just happened, right? The closer to the moment you report it that it happened, it has more timeliness. Okay, that one's pretty straightforward. Novelty. Novelty is the, oh, this doesn't happen every day. All right, that's an element of interest for people. Tornadoes happen frequently in Oklahoma. They typically happen in our, spring tornado season. But if we get a tornado in October, that's a bit more novel, right? And so tornado in October, one of the elements of interest that it has is this doesn't happen frequently in Oklahoma in October. Okay. Human interest. Human interest is just built on the idea that people are interested in other people, right? Something may not be incredibly impactful to a lot of people. It might not really have that timeliness factor, like the whole story of someone's career is not super timely. But if you can weave a human interest story, right? If it's just something that hits us on a level of humanity, that's human interest, right? And there's different hobbies and different pets are always human interest. We love a good pet story. Most people, not all, but most. Conflict, of course, is an important element for newsworthiness. Multiple sides of a story, right? I try very much not to say 2 sides to the story, right? 2 people, 2 different sides of the story, and they're at odds with each other. They have the conflict. Usually it's multiple sides of a story, right? Multiple people, multiple groups having different ways of looking at something that can cause conflict. All right. Now, we shouldn't try to increase conflict where there isn't any, but conflict is always an interesting way to frame media writing if the conflict is there. Proximity. Proximity is about closeness, how close a story or an issue is to the audience. Proximity can be thought of in 2 different ways. It can be thought of as geographical proximity. All right. So again, that example of if there was a tuition increase on the OU campus, that is geographically, physically close to you. You go to OU, that's going to affect you. Right. So a geographical closeness, the tornado happened in your town. The tuition increase is happening at your school. The number of COVID cases are increasing in your community, right? Proximate to you geographically. The other way to think of it is emotional proximity. All right. So um, if someone in your family has gone through breast cancer treatment, you might see a story about breast cancer and it's not anything geographically close to you, but it's emotionally close to you. That's going to get your attention. Another thing to think about with that would be like, you all as college students, there are going to be issues, let's say like guns, or acts of violence on college campuses. If there's a shooting in a college campus several states away, that's still emotionally close to you as a college student. So anyway, two ways to think about the proximity thing. All right, and then prominence. The more prominent a person is, the more well-known, the more celebrity status they have, the more prominent they are, the less they have to do to be newsworthy, right? If a celebrity attends a sporting event, just them attending a sporting event and being famous might make the news. But you or I attend a sporting event, like who really cares about that? All right, so the more prominent you are, the less you have to do to be in the news. Okay, then the last element, currency. What you might be thinking, well, currency sounds a bit like timeliness to me. Yeah, they're related, but there is enough of a difference for them to be two separate things on this list. I want you to think about currency as kind of a long simmering issue and something brings it to the surface. All right. So something that's, fresh still in all our minds is everything we all went through during lockdown and the pandemic. Now, there were problems that were already there, and then the pandemic lockdown brought them out, right? Hurricane Katrina, back in the day, there were already problems in that area, and then the disaster of Hurricane Katrina brought other problems to the surface. So something that's long simmering, it's been there, but we haven't been talking about it for some reason, and then all of a sudden it jumps up to the top of the news. And then after a few days or months, it'll usually, bubble back down under the surface. So timeliness is just about now. Currency is a little bit more intricate than that, a little bit more detailed than that. Okay, so those are the interest elements. And the reason we're talking about these now, when you're about to do the news leads assignment, is because when you as the writer are deciding how to write a piece of media, in this case, you're deciding how to write the news leads, how to start a story, you have to use your news judgment to decide which interest elements to focus on. Because a lot of times a piece of news, a situation, an issue, has multiple interest elements. But you usually just want, if it has all of the interest elements, that's one hell of a story. It usually is not going to have all. But you can't really focus on them all at the same time up front, or you can't even really focus on 3 or 4 up front. You're usually going to pick 1 or 2 interest elements to focus on in the beginning. You might get to more of them later, but that idea of the tuition increase, right? If that's the information you have to work with, you might think, okay, there's some conflict here. There's bound to be, differences of opinions about this. And so that's definitely an interest element with that story. But there's also an impact on a lot of people at this school. So I think maybe I'm going to focus on that impact first. And so your first sentence or 2 of your story, you might focus more on the impact and then get to the conflict a little bit later. That's just one way to think about it. But think about these elements of interest when you are deciding how to start those news leads, right? It's like, how are you going to frame this story? What are you going to do to get the audience's attention right off the bat with your first sentence? Okay. All right. So that's the lecture on interest elements, and I'll see you in the next video.